A clash of the greatest generals of their age, the end of the Napoleonic era, the last stand for the gravedigger of the Revolution, the greatest triumph of the Duke of Wellington. There are many ways to summarize the Battle of Waterloo that play up its epic scope and seemingly decisive place in history. However, while most history lessons skim the surface of this campaign between about 125,000 French soldiers and 220,000 Allied soldiers, the truth was that it was a more fascinating, grim, and bizarre battle than most people imagine or than most pieces of pop culture will depict. So let's go exploring the historically neglected aspects, unseemly details, and bewildering headspaces of that fateful day of June the 18th, 1815. Number 10. The Preliminary Battles. Waterloo is the battle that became a household name, but 2 days earlier, on June 16, 1815, the stage was set by two battles at the town of Ligny and Quatre Bras. At Ligny, Napoleon commanded the French army against the Prussians under Field Marshal Gebhard Blücher and the British-Dutch army at the strategic Quatre Bras crossroads. At Ligny, the battle was especially vicious. The town of Ligny itself was devastated by fire as troops fought building to building. While Napoleon was unable to inflict complete destruction on the Prussian army, he still left them so thoroughly beaten that Blücher was trampled by horses in the process. The Prussians suffered roughly 16,000 casualties, while the French suffered about 12,000, but the Prussians were left in such disarray that roughly a further 8,000 deserted. Quatre Bras became Field Marshal Ney, holding off Wellington's army as the Prussians were dealt with. The Allies had been tricked by a feint towards Mons near the coastline, and bad intelligence fed to their spies, which had convinced Wellington that the French were going to try to cut his army off from the sea. As a result, the Allies were only able to bring a fraction of their strength to bear against Ney as they attempted to correct for this blunder and join the Prussians. It still became an overwhelming force against the French, and though Ney held Wellington off for the day, the French were still driven from the field at a cost of about 4,000 casualties to both sides. Wellington was then able to march for the defensively favorable hills of Mont Saint-Jean. Number 9. Napoleon's crude strategy. Few generals understood the need for finesse and cleverness of tactics like Napoleon Bonaparte. One of his sayings was, "Never attack a man in a prepared position." Yet during his great confrontation with Wellington at Waterloo, Napoleon ordered frontal attacks at the British army. That gave the British the ability to conceal themselves along the crest of a hill, while a flanking attack would have deprived them of that cover. Frontal attacks usually depend on overwhelming strength to break enemy formations, but Napoleon's army was only slightly larger than Wellington's, roughly 72,000 to 68,000. Indeed, just 2 days before, one of the keys to Napoleon's victory at Ligny had been a dramatic flanking attack. Frontal attacks should have been one of the last things on his mind. It has been asserted that if Napoleon had pursued the Prussians properly after winning at Ligny, then it would have assured his strategic victory. After all, Wellington was in no position to pursue Napoleon after Quatre Bras, and Blücher's army was too badly mauled and scattered to put up much of a stand. Indeed, it took 2 attempted rallying points for the Prussian army to start coming together. If Blücher's army was out of commission, Napoleon could have brought overwhelming strength to bear against Wellington, since he wouldn't have needed to dispatch Grouchy's 30,000 as he did in real life. But then again, hindsight is 2020. Number 8. Rain that won the day. Whatever strategy Napoleon had adopted in dealing with his enemy armies, there would have been the complicating factor of rain on June 17, 1815. This, more than anything else, led to Napoleon's defeat. It caused him to begin his attacks on the British army at a relatively late 11:30 in the morning, and gave the Prussian army vital time to arrive on Napoleon's right flank and ultimately drive them from the field. It also gave the British a significant artillery advantage. The French relied heavily on solid cannon balls or explosive rounds, which tended to get embedded deeper in the soft mud and thus have their effectiveness dampened. Meanwhile, the British relied heavily on Henry Shrapnel's canister fire, as they had for much of the Peninsular Campaign from 1809 to 1814. Since it effectively turned their cannons into shotguns, the mud had no effect on their fire. Number 7. Royal Scots Greys' awkward charge. Late in the battle, the Highland infantry regiments in the British centre of the line were wavering and seemingly on the verge of collapse, and with the British right already close to breaking, it would have spelled the end. The British army had an ace up its sleeve, though, a regiment called called the Royal Scottish Greys that were quite peeved that they hadn't been able to fight the French the day before at the Battle of Quatre Bras. They were ordered to attack the advancing French. Despite our popular depictions of this attack, such as the 1881 painting Scotland Forever or the movie Waterloo melodramatically presented it with horses at full gallop, the ground was so soggy and uneven at the Battle of Waterloo that the soldiers attacked at barely above walking speed. Still, they penetrated the French infantry, managed to reach the French artillery and drive away the crews, and they captured one of the beloved eagles of the French army and, most significantly, gave their associates time to rally and save the British centre. Turns out, attacks don't have to be flashy to get dramatic results. Number 6. The French army's last chance. When Napoleon ordered his Imperial Guard to attack the British at 7:30 p.m., it is often portrayed as his last-ditch effort. After all, the Imperial Guard had been unbeaten for decades and was thought to be unbeatable. In truth, even if the Imperial Guard had broken Wellington's army, there would have been little chance for the French. The Prussians were still attacking from Napoleon's right flank with tens of thousands of fresh troops. No matter how elite they were, the Imperial Guard were only several thousand and they were the final reserve. Prussians would have almost certainly driven them from the field either way. The actual last chance Napoleon had was at roughly 3 p.m. That was when the British army needed to resupply their troops stationed at La Haye-Sainte, which controlled access to their centre and would have allowed the French to split their lines early enough to then be able to reform and stand against Blucher's Prussians. The French nearly captured this position in time, but ultimately they didn't capture it until 6 p.m. As it happened, around 3 p.m. the French army became distracted from La Haye-Sainte in a big way. Number 5. The misconceived cavalry charge. As the British struggled to resupply their forces at La Haye-Sainte, Wellington gave an order that inadvertently saved the position for the British. He had his troops along the centre ridge reposition themselves. To Field Marshal Ney, it looked like the British were beginning a retreat, and thus he gathered over 10,000 horsemen to attack. Since it was uphill, over muddy ground, the French were not attacking with anywhere near full force. Even if the conditions had been more favourable, it likely wouldn't have meant victory for the cavalry, as the British infantry formed into squares. In squares, their lines became effectively walls of bayonets, and so the French cavalry, they were forced to ride fruitlessly around them. The stand still ended up costing the British army dearly. Ney saw that his cavalry charge wasn't working early on, but forming squares left the British troops much more vulnerable to French artillery, even with mud lessening the effectiveness of their cannonballs. It wasn't so much standing up to French horsemen as standing up to heavy losses of the barrages between the cavalry charges that ultimately won the day for the British centre. Such was the ferocity of their stands that Ney had 5 horses shot from out underneath him. Number 4. The controversial Dutch-Belgian Roll. While the British soldiers of Waterloo were credited with putting up a brave and stubborn defence, and the Prussians were revered for saving the day, the Dutch-Belgian troops, known as the Hussars in Wellington's army, were given little to zero credit. Admittedly lightly experienced both at Quatre Bras and Waterloo itself, the Dutch Belgians were routed and chased off the field by French cavalry. The situation was especially grievous at Quatre Bras, with the massively outnumbered cavalry being forced to flee into the ranks of the Dutch militia, which resulted in chaos that made both forces easy pickings for the pursuing French soldiers. As if that wasn't a sufficient enough indignity, in 1971, a diary by Lieutenant Colonel William Tomkinson was published. It was alleged in the diary that at Waterloo, large numbers of Dutch troops didn't even fight in the battle at all, they were just raiding the British supplies in the rear. This has subsequently been dismissed as either an exaggeration or a full-blown fabrication by the diary's editor, but the damage to the reputation of the Hussars, it was already done. Number 3. No quarter. One of the grimmer aspects of the Battle of Waterloo was that while the French army was being routed, the order went up among the Prussians and the British that no quarter be given. For the Prussian cavalry, cutting down retreating French men, even those that were surrendering, became something of a sport. Blucher's chief of staff, for one, described the hours of prisoner butchery as the finest night of his life. The French had hardly been paragons of virtue up to that point. There had been no quarter given to the Prussians at Ligny 2 days earlier, or to any captured British troops at Waterloo. The belligerents were bitter enemies at that point, from decades of war, with each nation having been in some way ruined by the others through Napoleon's disastrous continental system. The sentiment at this time was so brutal that General Francois Reguet of the Imperial Guard ordered that any man who brought back a prisoner was to be shot. Number 2. Waterloo dentures. Roughly 48,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in the Battle of Waterloo, meaning thousands of corpses littering the formerly pleasant Belgian countryside. To many people who visited the battlefield in the immediate aftermath, this meant the ground was rich with white gold, and teeth were being pried out of the mouths of corpses to be used for dentures. This was a time when the mouths of the wealthy were almost invariably full of rotten teeth from all the sugar in tea and sweets. This wasn't just vindictiveness against the French invaders, it happened to Prussian, Dutch, and British dead. Since a full mouth could yield £100 at a time when that was more than many people's yearly salaries, many people became amateur dentists. For those wondering why this would happen at the Battle of Waterloo and not at the dozens of other equally large battles during the Napoleonic Wars, the answer is that it probably did happen elsewhere. There's no surviving evidence that people at the time knew their teeth came from the dead of battles, and it does seem like a ghoulish thing that no one would want to advertise. It wasn't until 1832 that the practice was formally banned. Number 1. The very last victory. There was something of an ironic postscript to Waterloo, and that's that the French technically won the very last day of the campaign. Even as Napoleon was being so fiercely pursued back to Paris that he was forced to abandon his carriage, Field Marshal Grouchy was still fighting with the rear guard under General Johann von Thielmann. Both the French and Prussian forces fought very capably and bravely and suffered very equal casualties, but the most significant factor was that 30,000 French troops weren't at Waterloo, and they did nothing to slow Blucher's arrival at the main battle. Indeed, practically as soon as Grouchy drove the Prussians from the field, a distraught French messenger arrived and told him that the war was effectively lost. Imagine the look of disappointment that must have crossed Grouchy's face when he learned that 2,600 of his men had been killed or wounded for, if anything, much less than nothing. And then they had to go home in disgrace. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. We got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. When you're subscribing, hit the bell so you find out when we put out a new video. Also, why not check out my new channel called Geographics? I'm going to link to that below. It's a sort of a geography, sort of history-based channel. Like I say, link to below. Check it out if you want to. And thank you for watching.